Hey guys, if you like what you see in this video, maybe think about subscribing. Or don't, it's not a hard sell. Before we start, I just want to point out I've recently been experimenting with live streams in my playthrough of the game Horizon Zero Dawn. I'm trying to see how far I can get while playing on the hardest difficulty without dying once. If that seems like something you'd be interested to see, I usually stream at around 4 o'clock on weekdays. Check it out. I could really use some live support. With that being said, on to the video. Hello and welcome to another episode of From Pixels to Pictures, where we analyze film adaptations of video games and try to figure out where exactly they went wrong. With that being said, let's talk about Street Fighter 2. Yes, it's common in the video game world for sequels to be better than their predecessor, but this is an especially notable example of that. The arcade game Street Fighter just sort of came and went without much fanfare, and apparently the game really doesn't hold up well today for the few who have played it. Street Fighter 2, on the other hand, was a huge success, and it's easy to see why. The game has slick control, fun action, and a number of memorable characters that gamers could quickly get behind. The film adaptation, simply titled Street Fighter, was the third video game movie ever made, at least according to my list. It was released around Christmas time in 1994 and starred Jean Claude Van Damme as well as the late Raul Julia. While reviews were less than stellar, it did manage to do something that neither Super Mario Bros. Nor Double Dragon was able to accomplish. It turned a profit at the box office. Okay, it wasn't a huge success, but it was just enough to get more Hollywood companies to think that maybe video game movies could actually be a way to make money. I have to admit, I enjoyed this film considerably more than the previous two films I looked at for this list, and as I'm writing this, I'm genuinely curious as to whether or not this film can score higher than an F. Well, let's find out. Round 1. Characters. Now, in the last two videos I made, I pointed out how, when it comes to the original games, both Super Mario Bros. And Double Dragon are pretty weak as far as characters are concerned. Two brothers who are the heroes, a damsel, a one-note villain, and the villain's henchman. Which game did I just describe? Both of them. They're really interchangeable. But once you get to Street Fighter, there is a very noticeable difference. In the first two games, the characters were just there because they had to be. But in this game, the whole entire game is based around the characters, and all of the main characters get lengthy descriptions from the game manual. There are eight main playable characters. When you boot up this game, you have the option of playing as Ryu and Edmund Honda, and Blanca, and Guile, and Ken, and Chun-Li, and Zangief, and Dalsim, and the Millionaire and his wife. You get the idea, there are a lot of characters. But wait, that's not all. In addition to the playable characters, they also had to include Balrog, Vega, Sagat, and Bison, and a few other Street Fighter characters from separate games, giving them all ample screen time and their own character arc. So basically what this movie had to do was, yeah, basically that. And don't get me wrong, this movie is not anywhere near as good as Infinity War, but for what they had to do, the result isn't bad. Now, we've got a lot of characters to get through, so I'll try to go quickly. The filmmakers chose Guile to be the protagonist, which is a little weird since most fans of the game series consider Ryu and Ken to be the actual main characters of the games, but whatever. When I played Street Fighter 2 for research, I always chose to play as Guile, knowing that he was the film's protagonist. The instruction manual doesn't say much about him, just that his best friend Charlie recently died in the war, and that this tragedy fills him with vengeance. Now, there's no real problem with choosing to focus on Guile as the protagonist, and even the way he's written in the film isn't that bad. The problem, however, lies in the casting. In the games, the most prominent thing that we know about this guy is that he is an all-American soldier, as patriotic as apple pie. So naturally, the filmmakers went with the classic American actor, Jean Claude Van Damme. Now, I wasn't around during this guy's heyday, but from what I could gather, Van Damme seemed to be the poor man's Arnold Schwarzenegger. He looks cool, he does some nice stunts, but he also doesn't have a lot of acting range, and his accent can be a little funny. According to Wikipedia, Capcom had long envisioned Van Damme as Guile, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. His accent can be very distracting considering that the character he's playing is supposed to be American, and as for his acting, it's hardly an Oscar-worthy performance. but it's not really bad per se, it's just a typical action movie lead role without a ton of depth to him. I do wish they had added a little bit of drama to his role, but seeing how many characters they had to juggle, I understand why they made that choice. But if Jean Claude Van Damme is lacking in the acting department, Raul Julia more than makes up for that. Now unfortunately, Raul Julia had stomach cancer throughout production, and he tragically passed away 2 months before the film's release. But Julia, knowing full well that this would be his final performance, decided to put everything he had into this role, and it shows. While the role of M. Bison might not be terribly complicated on paper, Raul Julia delivers 120%, resulting in the film's best performance. Over the top and hammy at times, but also very calm and precise when he needs to be, Raul Julia makes M. Bison a very memorable villain. One of the best things about this performance is the sheer amount of confidence he has. Remember, this is a 52-year-old man with no martial arts training and stomach cancer. And yet he convinces the audience that M. Bison is a force to be reckoned with in the fighting arena. That is impressive. Our next character is Chun-Li, played by Ming-Na Wen. Chun-Li from the games is probably one of the first real action heroines in the gaming world, and she also has a backstory that makes her story much more personal. In the film, while their excuse to put her in the iconic red outfit was a little weak, they did a great job in making her look like the game character. On top of that, she also showed real fighting capability, even managing to give Bison a run for his money. There's just one problem: as great as Chun-Li is in the first 2 acts, once the climax starts, she really doesn't do anything. Sure, she's one of several people helping the hostages escape, but I would have liked to have seen her do a little bit more to bring Bison down. Oh well, at least she doesn't have to be rescued. Wow, I just spent a lot of time talking about 3 characters, and we still have so many more characters to talk about. So you know what? It's time to speedrun this analysis. Ryu and Ken, these 2 brothers both had some arc, but they felt a lot like Billy and Jimmy in Double Dragon. But at least these guys had more interesting characters, as well as individual personalities. Honda. They decided to race-bend this character from the games, and while the result is a little stereotypical at times, I do feel like they capture the essence of the character well enough. Blanca. Is it me, or does every video game movie have to have a transformation subplot? Oh well, this transformation subplot was better than the other 2, and to be perfectly honest, I actually like the idea of combining Charlie and Blanca into the same character. Aside from killing 2 birds from 1 stone, it also gives us an insight into M. Bison's plan and his view on the world. Zangief. It's funny because even though this guy was a playable character in the game, he's gained a reputation for being a villain. Just look at Wreck-It Ralph. So this guy is pretty much the typical villain's henchman who turns good, but he does get some laughs. In my opinion, his change the channel line is undeniably the funniest part of the movie. Dawson. Of the 8 playable characters, this is the only example where the movie really missed the mark on what the character was all about. He spends most of the movie as a doctor, and then near the end suddenly starts looking like his game counterpart without any explanation. What, was there some deleted scene that I missed? Well, at least he acts the part well. Balrog and Sagat. To be honest, these characters were forgettable in both the game and movie. They work well enough as villains. I feel like they're trying really hard not to get lost in the shuffle of all these characters. Wow, there's a lot of characters. And finally, stop the music. I wanted to save Vega for last. In the game, this character really made an impression, and not just because he kept kicking my butt over and over. Okay, maybe that's part of the reason. The point is, this character did a great job in transition. While he's a little less vain than his game counterpart, the outfit is just a dead ringer. Seriously, they absolutely nailed this character. Okay, so there's obviously a lot of characters to juggle. I made the Infinity War comparison earlier, and I think it's a fitting comparison. If I had been making this movie, I'm not entirely sure how I would go about including all of these characters. And I imagine a lesser director would have cut many of these characters, so I think it's brave that the filmmakers not only tried to include all the characters, but also give each one an arc within the narrative. I also want to applaud the movie for actually having a diverse cast of ethnically appropriate actors, something that even today Hollywood seems reluctant to do. While I think a number of the characters could have been done better, it was genuinely exciting to see many of the characters from the game come to life. There was genuine effort to pull this off, and for that, I give it a 7 on the scale. Our next round is setting, and there's not really a whole lot to talk about here, but that might actually be a good thing. The game is a globe-trotting adventure. The stages are set in the USA, Brazil, Japan, China, India, Russia, and more. And since we're moving from 8-bit graphics to 16-bit graphics, the scenery in this game looks really good. In the movie, all the action takes place in a fictional Asian country known as Shadowloo. Some fans might be disappointed in this, but the decision does make sense from both a budget perspective, but also from a story perspective. It helps if all the characters are somewhat close to each other. Now, we've talked about setting before on this show. Some production designers thought it would be a good idea to turn this into this, and this into this. From a setting perspective, those two movies completely missed the point of the source material that they were trying to adapt. But this movie doesn't screw up. Now don't get me wrong, ideally it would have been nice to see all these different locations come together in one movie, but at least this movie feels like it takes place in the same universe that the game's established. I mean, look at the scene with Vega. In the game it looks like this, and in the movie it looks like this. This feels like a direct translation from the source material, and it's not the only scene that looks like something out of the game. And yes, M. Bison's lair and a number of other locations don't quite match up, and this use of a game controller is a bit too tongue-in-cheek. But many of the locations do have a taste of Asian culture, which works well in establishing locations and referencing the game. I especially like the circus scene, where they snuck the word Capcom on the barrels, referencing how many times the word appeared in the background of the game. I'm not going to act like the imagery in the movie is amazing, and there's certainly a bunch more that they could have done. Truth be told, there's nothing terribly outstanding about the setting of this movie in its own right, but the fact that the production designer at least made an effort is worth pointing out. I'm giving it a 6. Round 3 looks at story. Seeing how the game had so much focus on characters, you'd think there would be a big story that the filmmakers could really use. But no, the game really doesn't have much of a story at all. Judging from the game manual, the story of this game can be summed up in 3 words: martial arts tournament. And there really is no martial arts tournament in the movie. Interestingly, the movie Mortal Kombat came out shortly after this did, and that did involve a martial arts tournament, so maybe the studio decided that one tournament-based video game adaptation was enough and they changed the plot to reflect that? I don't know, we'll talk about that movie next time. So, because they decided to abandon the tournament plot, they had very little to work with and had to make up their own plot from scratch. A plot that had to include all the characters and give them all arcs, as I've said before. And while the story of this movie is definitely flawed, we definitely could have gotten a lot worse. In the film, Bison is a dictator who is holding several hostages for a very high ransom, while also trying to create a super mutant in the form of Blanca. Much of the film is centered around Bison, and we get a very clear sense of what he wants. It's not just power and domination like Cooper or Robert Patrick. It's clear that through Julia's performance, he sees himself as a good person. And to be fair, the idea of a power-hungry dictator who honestly believes he's humble isn't as far-fetched today as it once was. The overall story is not without its plot holes and tricky details, but this movie's primary goal is to be a dumb, fun action movie. And for the most part, that's how it comes across. However, there is one key factor where I would have liked to see the writers try a little harder, and that was the main character, Guile himself. I've mentioned before how I like to play all these games myself to prepare for making these videos, and keep in mind, this game came out in a time when video games were a lot harder to beat. So I wasn't able to actually beat Super Mario Bros. Or Double Dragon, despite literally weeks of trying. But Street Fighter II actually offers unlimited continues, so after many, many deaths, I finally managed to beat the game. Now remember, I'm playing as Guile for the purpose of making an apt comparison. I don't know what the other characters' endings are like, but Guile's ending really took me by surprise. Just as he's about to deliver the killing blow, his wife and daughter show up, begging him not to do it. Guile realizes that he doesn't need to stoop to the level of becoming a murderer, and he's able to put his revenge behind him and go live a happy life. This scene, no joke, genuinely made me a little emotional. Yeah. Now to be fair, I'm the kind of guy who gets emotional at a lot of things, but this was 1991, way before it was common for video games to intentionally utilize emotional storytelling. This scene works great in bringing the story to a close and reminding the player that violence isn't always the answer. And again, I don't know what the other characters' endings are like, but if the filmmakers selected Guile as the main character, they should have found a way to utilize this scene. It wouldn't have been difficult to film, and it would have brought some much-needed humanity to the character and the overall story. And maybe it was because Jean Claude Van Damme can't really do emotional acting well, but come on. I want to have some sort of emotional attachment to the main character of the movie. Bottom line, I give them props for trying to write a story around all these characters, but there were a number of problems with the narrative. I like some of the decisions, but not others. In the end, it comes down to about a 50-50 split, which is why I'm giving it a 5 on the scale. Our last round is experience. Now, even though I liked this movie, in my opinion it has one fatal flaw. I haven't mentioned it until now because it wasn't relevant to the character's setting or story, but here it is. This movie has some of the worst editing I have ever seen in my life. I mean it, this film cuts between different scenes with seemingly no rhyme or reason. Even scenes taking place in the same location have a ton of simple continuity errors that really add up. There's also a bunch of random cutaway shots that don't add anything, and a number of random shots that only last half a second, if that. Editing is supposed to be seamless. If it's done well, you don't even think about it. But in this movie, the editing kept taking me out of the experience. I looked on IMDb to see who edited this movie, and guess what? It was 5 people. 5 people. And even crazier, 2 of them are Oscar nominees. So it looks like we have some sort of too many cooks in the kitchen scenario on our hands. But with all that being said, let's look at the action itself. As a number of people have pointed out, there is no actual street fighting in this movie. I understand how some people can complain about that, but it's hardly the first film to have a misleading title. The action scenes are all done nicely enough, that is, when the bad editing doesn't get in the way. Some of the best moments in the movie was when they would hold on a shot, like Chun-Li sneaking into the morgue, or this scene of Guile's team sneaking past the guards, which almost felt like something from an Uncharted game. Much of the good stuff in this movie stems from the villain, M. Bison. As someone who spent at least 4 hours trying to beat this guy in the game, I know how powerful M. Bison can be. During that fight, if you hesitate for even a fraction of a second, you're dead. Just like that. And they reinforced this idea early on in the film by having some of the hostages try to fight Bison and having him easily win these fights without even showing much interest. The frustration I felt towards Bison in the game was carried over to the movie. I genuinely believed that Bison was a dangerous force to be reckoned with and should not be underestimated. Given what they had to work with, given the source material, we were never going to get an Oscar-caliber masterpiece. This game was always going to be a fun, dumb action movie. And there's nothing wrong with that. And for the most part, this film feels like a fun, dumb action movie. I remember getting genuinely excited when I saw Vega, or when Bison directly quoted a line from the game, "Anyone who opposes me will be destroyed." The funny thing is, it took me a few seconds to realize that they had just quoted the game, as the line fit perfectly with M. Bison's established character in the film. The way I see it, this movie has 2 obvious, fixable problems. One is to get a better editor. The other is to add more dramatic weight to Guile's story. Fix those 2 things, and I could unironically call this film a good movie. But as a whole, I don't think the movie is as bad as everyone says it is. When I was doing research for this video, I came across a rather surprising fact that seemed to explain why I enjoyed this movie. Apparently, the director of this movie was a fan of the game! That so rarely happens in film adaptations of video games, but at least it shows that there was some effort put into the whole thing. In the end, I felt that certain aspects of the game experience were transferred just well enough for me to give it a 6 on the scale. So, when you add everything up, Street Fighter gets 24 out of 40, 60%, resulting in the score of D-. I have to say, I went back and forth on this one for a while, but ultimately I'm going to stick with my decision. I like that this movie has a passing grade, albeit the lowest passing grade possible. And while I understand that there are a lot of people who don't like this movie, and it certainly has its flaws, the filmmakers made a valiant attempt to translate this game into a movie, and I want to commend that. But what do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and join me next time when I take a look at the film adaptation of Mortal Kombat. See you then.